Alright, so in our first set of notes for Unit 9, focusing on World War II, we're going to look at the birth of World War II and what kind of situations caused it in other places besides the United States. So, while the United States did emerge from World War I relatively unscathed and untouched, much of Europe was devastated, and the Treaty of Versailles did cause significant lingering pain and anger, most of all for the defeated Germans. So when the worldwide depression came, suffering, fear, and resentment all planted the seeds of another far greater conflict. Alright, our first part is going to be turmoil in Europe. So, in Europe, some of the earliest signs of the post-World War I ill would be apparent in Italy. In 1922, the leader of the Italian Fascist Party, Benito Mussolini, became the prime minister. Now, Mussolini's dream was to restore Italy's ancient glory by building prosperity and reestablishing the ancient Roman Empire. So that means that they would have to go back into North America, and they did so by starting with Ethiopia. Now, for Germany, in the 1920s, that was a pretty terrible decade. They did not see the wonderful 20s that the Americans saw. The German Weimar Republic governed a defeated country. There was hyperinflation, and so between 1921 and 1924, this made the German currency virtually worthless. Shifting government coalitions were not able to create any type of stability, especially in the face of the country's need to pay the $33 billion in reparations to Great Britain and France. And then there was another $10 billion that they had to pay back to the United States. So when the worldwide depression hit in the 1930s, the German economy collapsed under the load of debt and inflation, but someone would soon come to power with a new political party to fix everything. And that person was Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler led the Nazis party, grew from a group on the streets in the 1920s to a very large group leading in the elections by 1933. In 1933, Hitler won the election as German Chancellor and promised that a greatly expanded German nation would provide living space for people of German nationality, but would push the others out, such as the Slavs and the Jews. They would push them out of the way to make room for the master race. Now, a month after coming to office, the Nazi Party issued a decree ending free speech and assembly in Germany. They arrested communist deputies in the German parliament, giving themselves the solid majority in the German parliament. Hitler also took the title Der Führer, or the leader, and later that year, as the United States is beginning the New Deal, the Nazi government outlawed trade unions and other political parties. They authorized a new police force to enforce all Nazi authority. Again, in 1935, when the United States is passing the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act, what's going on in Germany? The Nazi parliament passed the Nuremberg Decrees, which took away citizenship of German Jews, but excluded those from most professions and the military. This also made marriage of a Jew to a non-Jew illegal. Now, before long, the Germans, Jews, and those in Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and other territories under German control were being forced to wear the yellow stars to identify themselves. They were then packed into tightly controlled urban ghettos, and within 2 years, the first of them were being transported to slave labor or death camps. In the face of the Nazi attacks in Germany, and then in Austria, and then in Czechoslovakia, many Jews tried to leave Europe, but leaving Europe was more easily said than done. There were strict quotas set in place in the United States during the 1920s, remember the quota system, and the 1930s, and Britain only allowed a modest number of immigrants as well. So, while Germany was attacking its Jewish citizens, Hitler also renounced the clause in the Treaty of Versailles calling for the German disarmament and began building the new German army. A year later, Hitler marched his army into the Rhineland, which in the terms of the Treaty of Versailles was supposed to be kept troop-free. And Hitler then announced that the independent country of Austria was to be, henceforth and forevermore, now a German province. And so here you can see this little gap between France and Germany called the Rhineland that was supposed to be kept kind of neutral with no troops. So Hitler has come to power and he is changing Germany. Now we also have to talk about Japan. So while fascists were consolidating their power in Central Europe, militarists in Japan were also growing in power. The Japanese military had a strong anti-American strand, and many American policies excluded the Japanese, and so that just kind of, helped in this anti-American strand of Japanese. Now, what is the reaction to all of this happening after the Treaty of Versailles, the Roaring Twenties, except for Germany, and the mass worldwide depression? Well, in the face of so much worldwide violence and aggression, the government of Britain, France, and the U.S. did virtually nothing, while the League of Nations proved to be meaningless and non-aggressive and unhelpful. Now, the desire for peace was equally strong in Britain and France, mostly driven by the recent memories of World War I and the 420,000 soldiers that they lost in the one battle in 1916. But the next generation was determined to avoid war almost pretty much at any cost. So, as of late September 1938 in Munich, Germany, Britain's Prime Minister of the time, Neville Chamberlain, agreed to allow Hitler to claim the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of peace. Now, Chamberlain was greeted with large crowds in London on his return. He stopped the war, but was criticized by the later-to-be Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill, who called the Munich Agreement a total defeat. So he pretty much just kind of like, we'll give you this as long as you promise not to go to war. So, as France and Britain did pretty much nothing to stop the fascists, most people in the United States were even more determined to keep their distance from the whole situation and the whole conflict and go back to that wonderful policy that they've continued to use for years and years and years, isolationism. Which brings us to part 2. Even after everything Neville Chamberlain did with the Munich Agreement to try to avoid war, war begins. So, while Americans tried to ignore the developments in Europe and Asia in the late 1930s, because we're in our massive depression, Hitler was on the move. Hitler understood that the faster he acted, the greater his chances of success would be. So once Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, Prime Minister Chamberlain agreed to announce that Britain was committed to defend Poland, and that Hitler's force attacked that country, then Britain would retaliate and pretty much war would start. So Chamberlain is now seeing that the whole Munich Agreement and pretty much kind of giving in, appeasement-wise, is not going to work with Hitler. And so here you can see that the yellow in the map is the Sudetenland, which starts to border Poland. So they're just kind of working their way and taking over more and more land. Now, Mussolini at the same time, or a year later, is going to invade Albania, and that's when Hitler moves towards Poland. But Hitler actually shocks the world in August of 1939 by signing a non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union. So, though the countries were enemies and had radically different economic systems and ideologies, the two agreed to split Poland. So, Germany's going to take over Poland, and the Soviet Union's going to help, and they're not going to fight each other, but they're just going to get half of Poland. Now, FDR is quoted for saying, when he finds out about the non-aggression pact, that it has come at last. God help us all. And so pretty much Britain and France follow through on their promise to declare war on Germany since they invaded Poland, thus starting World War II. Now, back at home, FDR gave one of his famous fireside chats on September 3rd, informing the American people that the U.S. would remain neutral. But even a neutral country cannot be asked to close his mind or close his conscience. Therefore, at the time, the U.S. was not 100% neutral, and by 1939, more and more Americans were starting to have doubts about staying out of the battle as an actual possibility. Which brings us to the last part of this set of notes, World War II. So let's look at a couple of the major battles. We're going to start with the Battle of Britain. Okay? So at the beginning of 1940, Hitler hinted at a peace treaty, but in April invaded Denmark, and then Norway. So Hitler's on a move to take over land. Hitler won these locations by using a strategy called the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. And so he would attack from the land and in the sea simultaneously. Then on May 14th, 1940, the Germans crossed across the Magnet Line, which turned out to be pretty much useless, and then towards Paris. Italy joined Germany, declaring war on France. France surrendered, and for the next several years was pretty much governed by Germany, except for a very small puppet government led in southern parts of France. Now, by the summer of 1940, Hitler was the master of Europe. Thus, only Great Britain stood against Germany. Hitler was determined to crush Great Britain with his Luftwaffe, or his German Air Force. So Germany bombed Britain in the Blitz, as the British called it, eventually killing thousands of residents at the British capital. And so you can see here, there's the famous bridge in London crossing the Thames, and then the airplanes here. But pretty much Germany would fly across the English Channel every day and bomb London over and over and over again, pretty much throughout the whole summer. Now, every step that FDR took brought hostility from neutral advocates, because there were several Americans who, even though London is being bombed and France has been taken over and the Treaty of Versailles is just not being followed, they still just really wanted to stay neutral. So as the war raged on in Europe in the 1940, the U.S. was dealing with an election year. Now, FDR decided to go against George Washington's advice, and he actually ran for a third term. In the middle of his campaign, FDR asked Congress to institute a military draft, so if the country got caught up in the war, we would be prepared, and the draft would become quickly a law, and we wouldn't be caught in the situation we were in World War I, where we were like, oh, we're going to join, but we don't have anybody to fight. So we'd be a little bit more prepared than we were in World War I. Only a month after winning the election, FDR did receive an urgent message from Winston Churchill, Britain's new prime minister, for the need of supplies to continue fighting against Hitler. FDR went to the radio with another famous fireside chat and told the American people that the U.S. needed to be a great arsenal of democracy, a phrase which coined by FDR for the materials needed by Britain in its fight with Nazi Germany. FDR then proposed the Lend-Lease Act, which loaned military equipment to Britain and other World War II allies for the duration of the war. So we're not fighting in the war, but we supported Britain in World War I. Technically, no, we're not allies, but they asked for our help, so we're just going to send them the military supplies that they need. Well, then Hitler attacks suddenly on June 1941. Who does he attack? He attacks his ally, the Soviet Union, the country that he signed the non-aggression pact with. Now, while there was no love between the Soviet Union and the USA, Americans knew that if Nazi Germany defeated the Soviet Union, it would mean disaster. And so the Soviets were added to the Lend-Lease program as well. And so we started to send supplies that they might need, military equipment that the Soviet Union would need to continue to fight off Germany. Now, this made FDR and Churchill start thinking, and so the two came up with a plan. In August of 1941, FDR and Churchill met in Newfoundland and planned ways to work together, and they issued what is known as the Atlantic Charter, which was a statement of common principles and war aims. all while tensions grow in Japan. So while the U.S. focused on Europe, issues in the Pacific were building. So we're getting ready to have wars on both sides of us. The U.S. wanted to definitely avoid not only a two-front but a two-ocean war, and sought peace with Japan, but unfortunately it was not reached. So, to kind of wrap up everything that we've talked about and all these things that have started this massive Second World War that was supposed to be prevented by the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles, many of the issues which the world had believed were solved by World War I proved in the decades to follow to not be at all. Though the 1920s were a time of prosperity for the United States and most of the world, the worldwide depression rebirthed many issues yet to be resolved following World War II, and the world found itself yet again in a major world war. Now, keep in mind the United States is still not involved yet, but you can see how we might slowly be pulled into the Second World War.